Hi everyone, welcome to DiGRA Italia Talks. I'm Paolo Ruffino, Chair of DiGRA Italia and Senior Lecturer at the University of Liverpool. Today I'm really glad to have three fantastic guests. The event is organized on the occasion of the Italian translation of the book Gaming Essays on Algorithmic Culture, published by University of Minnesota Press in 2006. We have here with us today the author of the book, the original author, Alexander Galloway from New York University, and the two translators, Mauro and Giacomo. So just to give you an introduction to our guest, Alexander Galloway is a writer and computer programmer working on issues in philosophy, technologies, and theories of mediation. He's the author of several books on digital media and critical theory, including The Interface Effect, published by Politi in 2012, and Larwell Against the Digital, published by University of Minnesota Press in 2013. With Eugene Tucker and Mackenzie Work, he's the co-author of Excommunication, Three Inquiries in Media and Mediation, published by University of Chicago Press in 2013. With Jason E. Smith, Galloway co-translated the Tikkun book Introduction to the Long Digital Age to Civil War, semiotext, 2010. And his most recent book is Uncomputable, Play and Politics in the Long Digital Age, published this year by Verso. For 10 years, he has been working with RSG on Carnivore, Kriegspiel, and other software projects. We might actually say something about the Kriegspiel later today. Galloway has given over 200 talks across the US and in 10 countries around the world. His writings have been translated into 11 languages. He's the recipient of a number of grants and awards, including a Creative Capital Grant in 2006 and the Golden Nika in 2002 by Ars Electronica in Linz, Austria. The New York Times has described his practice as conceptually sharp, visually compelling, and completely attuned to the political moment. Thank you, Alexander, for being with us today. The translators in Italian of gaming are Giacomo and Mauro. Giacomo Pedini is artistic director of Mittelfest Italy. Giacomo's work is focused on theater, direction, drama, and as a researcher on the intersections between theater, performance, and writing in modern and contemporary ages. He's been researching also in practice as artistic director, the relations between theater and education, politics, and more recently, gaming. Mauro Salvador is research fellow at the Università di Modena in Reggio Emilia. He's the author of numerous texts on game culture, including In gioco e fuori gioco, il ludico nella cultura e nei media contemporanei, published by Mimesis in 2015. He works as a game designer with the Dot20 Collective, and he teaches game design at the Event Horizon School of Digital Art. So thank you very much, Giacomo and Mauro, for your work, for your translation work, and for being here with us this evening. So I have prepared a number of questions, but obviously I invite the guests to jump in at any moment and to make your comments. But I would like to actually, I would like to start with a question to Giacomo and Mauro, particularly about the publication this year with Luca Sossella Editore of the translation of Gaming, Saggi sulla cultura algoritmica. And I would like to ask you generally about the translation project. So my main curiosity is to, why this particular book at this particular time, how you think it's important and relevant in still now in 2022. And I also have a sort of follow-up question, which you can take separately or as part of the same question if you prefer. I know you have been working from quite different backgrounds, actually. So Mauro is more interested in game design and media studies, while Giacomo is has a background in theater performance. So I'm wondering, how do you see this book to be working perhaps at the intersection of these different fields? What are your, what kind of angles have kind of brought you to look in particular at this publication? Thanks.
I try to start considering that it's my fault at the beginning, but also because my point of view is more obviously general than the point of view in the specific of the game studies. I really consider gaming a very relevant book for philosophy and for aesthetics in general, and also with epistemological implications, quite relevant in the way of the arts are working right now in the relation between the system, the game, or the script or the drama, and the way people can be in relation to that, as not only as spectator anymore, but as actors, as gamer, as players of it. It's an important shift in the way we build up our perception of reality through simulations. I think is very important in this sense. The book is about video games, obviously, but video games are not only video games right now. It's more wide. And I think that the book can be read and relevant in this sense, not only for game researchers or game studies, but for philosophers and people interested in aesthetics in general at all. This is also these were my feelings when I discussed with Luca Sosella, the Italian editor, who decided to publish the book. In fact, the book is in a line of philosophy in general. It's not a line of only of media studies, for example. And if we consider media as medium in the very original sense, okay, but not like specific media studies as a subject. In this sense, I think that in 2022, the book is still very relevant because the focus of the book is still, obviously it's not the only focus, but to me, it's still relevant. The fact of the book as a work on the new way of living the art, using it as a medium to play, to understand, and to act on reality. That's at the end the point, in my opinion. And in this sense, I think the book is quite relevant because it's not specific for game studies.
Yeah, I pick up from that. Just to say that it was the theater guy that asked the game studies guy to translate this book. So that's really the proof that it's a work that works well in an intersection of practices and theories. And to me, gaming is an important book because the translation of gaming also is an important book because in Italy we basically lack of translation of game studies, especially in the decade from the 2000 to the 2010, 2015. We translated very little, very few books, very few works, and to me it's also I have an affection for for gaming because it's inside a bunch of titles of that period of time in which I was a student and then a researcher, and so gaming also with the books that I cited before we started our conversation. So Unit Operations by Ian Bogost or Jesper Jules, Alfrial, and many collections of essays from North America. To me, this is a little library, very important, and I would like to, in the future, maybe translate more from that, because you know, when in a very pragmatic way, when to my students I give them gaming to study. if it is translated, it's easier for them to approach it, and it's also easy for them to remember it in some way, in some ways. But beside that, and beside my nostalgia from the book and from 15 years ago, Gaming is an important book because it deals with themes that are very contemporary, very actual. So the representation of war in video games, the idea of control, the aesthetic of control, but also the idea of playing with the algorithm, and so to play in a functional way with games beside the narrative, etc., etc. So these are topics very contemporary in gaming in general, but also in mobile gaming, free-to-play gaming. That's very what we are dealing with today. So the book is perfect to start talking about these things. And also on a further note, when I teach game design to 20 years old, 19 years old people, they always want to learn the tools, you know, to produce things, and they always, not always, but often they forget that it's important to approach video games also from a cultural and political point of view, because only if you understand this, I don't know, this part of a product, you can design a better one yourself. And so gaming is an important book also because in a very bright manner show that to young students.
And
yeah,
I would like to say something more, Paolo, that can be also relevant in relation of what we are talking about. The way, for example, I discovered the book. That's interesting because I discovered the essay reading another Italian essay by Wu Ming, the narrative collective. It's the famous essay about a new Italian epic they published in 2008, just 2 years after the publication of Gaming. And it's very interesting that I read and I discovered the book thanks to Italian novelists. So it means that the question of the book is really sensible for the production of meanings through art nowadays. I think it's very interesting, this detail.
So is the book cited by Wu Ming? I completely missed
it's the essay, New Italian Epic by Wu Ming.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, I'm familiar, but I must have.
Yeah, in 2008. Yeah, it's there. I discovered the word algorithm.
Oh, right. Okay. All right, thank you. I might have a question for, actually, you know what, just going a little bit off route, this sort of little schedule that I prepared. So Mauro said something quite interesting about teaching to students. And that actually made me think that I believe most of you, I'm pretty sure Alexander Galloway also teach students both sort of critical theory modules and also programming modules, right? I believe you have a sort of double. So in what ways do you think it's important to sort of combine these two layers, so to speak, in teaching both? I'm personally, if I have to think about my own experience, I do teach classes that are either about media studies, game studies, but particularly in the past, I did some time at some students who were actually interested in learning digital media production. It's quite difficult to introduce them to a more kind of critical approach that goes a bit beyond the simply kind of the learning of the tools, as Mauro was saying. So in what ways do you think these two aspects are relevant in our teaching practice?
Yeah, I mean, I was, convinced at a very young age that theory and practice should have an important relationship with each other. And the difficulty, though, is it's hard. It's hard to do. We still live in a kind of two cultures problem where practitioners are often separated off from theorists and historians and other kinds of scholars. So it is a challenge, but I try to continue to work on both of those strands. So like you said, yeah, I teach, right now I'm teaching undergraduates Introduction to Programming. It's very, rudimentary. But and maybe we could get to this by the end. I think the answer is kind of a truism, but it bears itself out, which is that there really are things that you will never experience or ever discover unless you have a kind of tactile or tangible or sort of craft or production engagement with the material. I just think that's true. I mean, it may not be true about everything under the sun, but it's certainly true, I think, about the kinds of things that we're talking about today. So, for example, this book is 16 years old, and I'm glad people are still interested in it. I also have worked more recently on another game that's obsessed me for a long time, which we could maybe talk about, which is this game here, Guida Board's Game of War, which I've released recently under the name Kriegspiel. And the quick example there, which we could come back to at the end, is that there were all sorts of things that I never would have discovered about the game simply by interrogating the historical record and looking at archives and reading his published work and if I hadn't tried to restage the rules of the game in software. And in doing that, it led to a whole bunch of things that emerged. So just a general kind of, support for trying to integrate theory and practice.
Yeah, actually, we might actually jump straight on the game that you show us, the Game of War, which you recently released as a smartphone game. So actually, I wanted to ask you a question. So there is throughout gaming essays on algorithmic culture, but also throughout your production after that book, there has always been a particular attention to the work of the Situationist International Guida Board. And in your latest book, The Uncomputable, Playing Politics in the Long Digital Age, you actually go back to what in using the essays parlance might be described as a form of counter gaming, perhaps as a form of radical gaming, which is Guida Board's Game of War. And in that book, you have a very interesting reading of the transcription of a game played by the board and a friend, and where something quite interesting happens. Apparently, one of the two players makes some illegal moves. Actually, doesn't play the game according to the rules of the game. And I would agree with you when I read your description. You argue that it's probably the board who makes the mistakes, and I agree with you, because usually, if you make a game and you play with a friend, maybe your friend would be kind of expecting the game designer to correct their mistakes, but the game designer would probably not even notice if they make mistakes. So it's more likely that it was the board. But you derive from that actually an interesting reading of the meaning of that book for the board, for the sort of late part of the Situationist International, for his attention, actually, for also in relation to his apparent withdrawal from political conflicts, is also kind of geographical withdrawal. He moved away from Paris. He moved in the outskirts. So how is that game significant for you? How is it has been significant for the board, for the Situationists? What can we learn from it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And hopefully Mauro and Giacomo can jump in on this question as well, because I do think that the approach, the more recent approach, really grows out of stuff that I was trying to develop in the book called Gaming. But because that book, as you pointed out in the questions that you emailed me, gaming, you're right, it really does have a sort of focus on art and aesthetics, maybe in a more pointed way than some other books on games have done, and I wanted to sort of try to bring in the tradition of the avant-garde and try to understand that some way. Maybe more successful, less successful at different parts of the book. We'll probably want to talk about the counter gaming chapter, which has a sort of notorious history, maybe. But yeah, I guess the bad news is that Guy Debord is now on the App Store. So I apologize to all the people who are dismayed by that fact. I have a very kind of complicated relationship with Guy Debord. His widow tried to sue me for copyright infringement. So I have a sort of love-hate estranged dynamic between me and this object of study. So maybe putting Guy Debord on the iPad was a kind of perverse form of revenge. I'm not sure. But no, the answer is just very simple. I had never heard of this game. I was never an expert on Guy Debord or the Situationists like someone like Mackenzie Wark is. I was never an expert, but I had read the stuff and I had been interested in Debord. And I think I was reading, can't remember exactly where I hit upon it, but I was reading someone else's book, and maybe in a footnote or something, they made reference to it. And it was just such a shock to me that someone like Guy Debord, who I learned later actually started his own game company in the late 1970s with his publisher. And they released this game as a commercial game. They planned even to make a second one, although that was never consummated. And so just the kind of surprise of this sort of weird avant-garde artist and theorist that he made his own game company was sort of like too good to overlook. And so that set me off on this long journey that's over a decade now of studying this game, first building a prototype in Java several years ago. That version became obsolete, and then completely rebuilding the game from scratch to run on modern computers, including phones. So yeah, the big kind of reveal, you hinted at this kind of murder mystery that my writing was structured around, that there are all of these mistakes that appear in the documented game that he played with his wife, Alice Becker-Ho. And so finding these mistakes was interesting, trying to explain why the mistakes happen, trying to explain why only one player was making the mistakes and not the other player. Also trying to explain why the mistakes had never been discovered up until this point, through many rounds of editorial oversight and even translation and all of these publishing and editorial rounds. I never even found the mistakes until I replayed the game in code, and actually it was my code that found the mistakes for me. So that was also an interesting kind of sort of use of tools or something. Yeah, we can talk much more about it, but the gist is that I was expecting that Guy Debord would design a game with some of the Situationist themes in mind, right? Sort of critiques of spectacle and popular culture, or this idea of like détournement or dérive. I was expecting it to be, maybe even have Marxist themes or something about, revolution of everyday life or utopian experimentation in that way. And lo and behold, none of those things are in the game. So it's a very uncharacteristic work vis-a-vis his larger, body of work in terms of his films and writing. So that was also a kind of big, interesting intellectual problem that I tried to grapple with and tried to explain why that might be the case.
I'm super curious about how your code detected the design error of the original game. I don't know if you can provide an example of something that to clarify that, because it's very interesting to me.
Sure. Yeah. So these were discovered already maybe 10 years ago, in the early Java version of the game. And basically the first time we got it up and running, and I was working with a team, more solo in the newer version, but in the original prototype, it was definitely a team effort. And we finally got the version up and running. And the first thought was, oh, hey, there's this famous match, the match between Guy and Alice, right? They wrote a book about it. It's just, why don't we just replay that game in the software just for fun? Maybe that'll tell us something. And so I did, and I got to, I don't know how many moves in, and I realized I just physically couldn't advance the piece in the software. Software rules are typically very rigid, and unless you accommodate nuance and flexibility, you probably won't get it. Human interaction, I think, more naturally accommodates nuance and vagueness and et cetera. So I just literally got to a point where I actually had to activate a little cheat in order to simply move to the next turn. So and then overall, I think, I can't remember how many mistakes. I think maybe there were about, on average, 1 out of every 8 turns had a mistake. So there were a non-trivial number of mistakes. And I should be clear, some of them are more in the category of what we could call like a typo, whatever the version of a typo would be in algorithmic context. 1 or 2 of them were just flagrant cheating. And then maybe 5 or 6 of the mistakes were, in my interpretation, mistakes based on a narrow interpretation of the rules. But maybe if you had a more flexible interpretation of the rules, you wouldn't have fixated on that.
And just a quick follow-up. In your opinion, that's a problem coming from the game not being tested so much, or coming from the idea that the game should came up with errors and with mistakes, so the players have to deal with them and so on?
Yeah, I think it's mostly a consequence of, so the game itself, the combat mechanic, requires that you do a certain amount of simple arithmetic in your head. And so when you're doing that on a phone or on a computer, we made the decision as interpreters of this game to automate that arithmetical combat mechanic. So it's completely automated. The math is never going to be wrong, da 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 da. But if you're on a physical game board, and every move you have to make 7 or 8 arithmetical calculations in your head, you're bound to have moments where you don't actually do those right. So I don't think it was malicious or out of sloppiness or anything like that. It's just how things happen. I was more interested in almost not psychoanalyzing, but trying to just accept that as a symptom or a window into something else that might be going on behind the scenes. And so that's why I call it kind of a murder mystery, is that it led me to try to figure out, and this is what could maybe ties back to gaming. It led me to try to look at the let's call it the play style, the kind of signature of play style that the 2 game players had in this game, and the play style was extremely different. And I made all these visual diagrams, and for my own edification, to try to figure out what the quality of that play style was. And so that really, I think, brought me back to some of the principles from gaming about I don't know, looking beyond narrative, trying to understand, how that phrase, like playing the algorithm, that we could maybe talk about. What does it mean to play the algorithm? What does it mean to min-max the capacities of an algorithm? And it was clear that one player was doing that a lot, even though they were making these trivial mistakes, and another player wasn't doing that at all. And so that kind of fed into my evaluation of who was doing what.
Thank you.
Thanks. And if you might actually jump to that famous expression that kind of has been often cited in game studies from gaming about playing the algorithm. Yeah, so in the chapter on allegories of control, you look in particular at strategy games. So if I remember correctly, you mentioned maybe in the preface that the book started by playing Civilization and ended by playing World of Warcraft. So it is kind of based on your experience of this transition sort of between strategy games and of different kinds, right? Civilization by Sid Meier is a dominant example throughout the book. And so since 2006, there has been a proliferation of strategy games, and in particular, thanks to online gaming, there have been forms of quantification of the player's performance. And thinking in particular about the field of esports, competitive gaming, popular games such as Dota, League of Legends, and so on. They now have systems that quantify, map, and monitor the player's performance with a view on providing tools to improve their own performance. And so very often players end up basically playing the algorithm, but at a different level, at a different layer. So they play not just the game, but this sort of other layer of quantification of their own performance while playing the game, trying to improve numbers about themselves. Obviously, we can connect this to phenomena such as the gamification and the quantified self, which sort of bring a similar concept in the improvement of fitness and health. And I will say there is also in part a role is played by the platformization of digital leisure activities. Platforms such as Steam, they require the production and generation of data as part of their business model. So you're never just playing a game, you're also always kind of producing a certain amount of data that is connected to your profile. So what I'm thinking is, would you see this as a sort of acceleration of what you were writing in 2006? Or is there perhaps a sort of different layer of surveillance or self-surveillance going on? Are we moving into a different kind of regime of data, of surveillance capitalism, as some others might say, or is this in continuation with what was happening already with Civilization by Sid Meier?
Yeah, I think you're bringing out something that has changed and accelerated dramatically since the book was written. So, you know, the book was published in 2006, and that's really the dawn of what we now call, you know, Web 2.0 and this, you know, this sort of data-centric era of computation that we really still live in today. We're still maybe even in the beginning of that era. So a lot more would have to be added, I think, to that book to fully accommodate platform capitalism and sort of data-driven economic models. But I love your question because you're getting at the heart of how maybe gamers sort of almost like precipitate that transition, right? And yeah, for me, this notion of playing the algorithm is very important. I should be clear, games are wildly diverse and they can be whimsical and creative. They don't have to be strongly rule bound. But of course, many games do have highly refined rules that have to be constantly balanced, you know, balance patches to make sure that the gameplay is balanced. And so focusing on that category of games, yeah, my stress in that chapter 4 that you referenced on allegories of control was really to, you know, just stress that mechanics matter, that, you know, gameplay design matters. Narrative also matters too. But at the time, I really felt like game studies had to focus on combat mechanics, the structure of game design, even the structure of the software and the hardware, which often gets left out. And, you know, you could take, for example, a game like the Total War series, so like Rome Total War, those kinds of games. And you know, they're in a certain sense, maybe this is hysterical or overly reductive or something, but that kind of signature gameplay in those types of games, these sort of massive groups of soldiers, is a direct response to the preponderance of object-oriented programming patterns and batch processing on the CPU, right? If you can send, 200 textures to the CPU all at once, to the GPU all at once. So that's what I was kind of edging toward in gaming, is to try to look at the sort of material infrastructure of software and hardware and to see the artifacts that will emerge. And it's really those artifacts that then become not completely the content of gameplay, but they become an important aspect of gameplay. So I think today, one thing I would have added in that chapter today would be to talk explicitly about metagaming, what people call metagaming, right? So, I think games lead to metagames. There's a kind of a natural progression that a game will sort of elicit its own metagame, meaning that once you start playing the algorithm, you discover a secondary level of sort of local distinctions and inconsistencies within the algorithm, right? You learn, okay, maybe one class is OP'd, a certain character can hide easier in the landscape than another character, maybe, so you want to play that one. Maybe you find a good spot to, farm a spawn point for your in-game crafting profession. Or maybe you just have a faster internet connection and faster graphics card than someone else, and that gives you a kind of advantage. So yeah, I think that you're right, that gaming somehow anticipated or precipitated the shift into a world where data analytics don't follow the technology, but actually sort of push it and lead it. And maybe, I don't know, maybe we can accelerate that too and think about this sort of meta, kind of playing the meta might also be a relevant thing to talk about in other parts of digital culture. I'm not sure. We could talk about that more.
Thank you. May I ask you, as you were kind of answering this question, made me think, in this transition between the game and the metagame, what do you think happens of the representational level? So in a sense, is it perhaps the problem there that there is a transition between being attached, also emotionally attached, effectively brought to play a game first to its representational level, and then maybe there is a sort of second stage where we transition towards, where we start playing the algorithm and then move towards a sort of meta game where the representational level almost disappears. Because many authors now in game studies are, for instance, bringing back a more attentiveness to the image, and particularly through affect theory, in a way also to explain, for instance, why games that are very similar to each other, and thinking particularly about clone games on smartphones that are played almost exactly in the same way, but they have different kind of representational strategies, and some of them are extremely successful while others are not. So in a sense, the representational layers still seem to be meaningful in a way, right? Even when we play the algorithm. I don't know, how do you
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think that's true, and we have to keep those two things together. Maybe, part of the experiment of the book Gaming was to ask, not so much is that distinction invalid, but to say, well, can algorithms also have an aesthetics? Right? So in other words, yes, we could talk about the aesthetics of the interface or narrative or image, pictorial elements, all of those things. But, and this is what I tried to do in the chapter on social realism, can we have a bona fide aesthetic theory for algorithms, right? And I mean in a strict sense, like, syllogisms or 10 lines of code. Can we do an aesthetic of 10 lines of Java code, or 100 lines? If it's Java, it's not going to be 10, it's going to be 50 lines of Java code. And so, yeah, so my only kind of pushback would be, I think, yes, the tendency to play the meta means that the kind of primary aesthetic and narrative interaction tends to be diminished, right? But I also think that maybe there is an autonomous aesthetic experience that's happening in the meta itself. So that's how I would want to push the conversation.
I totally agree with this point of Alexander, because the question of meta in the art, it's as a way to discover and to make explode a code, a system, a structure, a drama, and so on. It at the beginning it is so, but the question is always the dialectic, the dialectical relation between the point of beginning and the point of arrival. When you start to work on meta art, you enter in a new dynamic in which what it was at the beginning a new discovery, a new step in understanding the mechanics of the art. Now it's itself a new kind of language, totally independent. So you have to build again a dialectic, a dialect. This is very relevant. It happened, for example, in the history of theater with epic theater by Bertolt Brecht. At the beginning, the Brecht idea was a revolution because the system of the bourgeois drama theater was evident. But in a couple of in a couple of decades, it became a language itself, so a new aesthetics. And this is also the problem of counter gaming, as counter art in general, is always something in evolution. You have to consider it as a path. Yeah.
Absolutely. Maybe it would be a way to bring in questions of genre and aesthetic tradition, right? That might be how we would talk about it in other fields. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
About this idea of, sorry, Paolo, just a quick remark about this idea of the aesthetic of meta. I keep thinking about teaching, about explaining to students and try to make them work on things in ways they didn't experiment before. So game designer, I don't know, first year game designer, I don't know, they always struggle to separate the representational part you talked about before, Paolo, from the systemic part of the game. So one very, very useful exercise is to make them design games only as systems. So they have to convince me that their system is good, even if there is no aesthetic part, no representation whatsoever. And they rarely succeed, obviously, because it's very hard to create a system that is satisfactory in itself. But that's a way. So I see that aesthetic in the idea to reach a moment in which the system is perfect and you understand it and you dominate it and so on. There's also a tool to design resource management that is called Machinations, a digital tool that is very pretty. It's very nice, and you can use it to design resource systems, but also, in my opinion, is an example of something that has an aesthetic in its own, with all these dots moving and generating and disappearing and so on.
I think this is a huge problem, and it's part of the reason why, while I will admit that I'm probably not entirely, the argument about counter gaming is not entirely defensible in 2022. I do want to actually hold on to a central insight, I think, in that chapter, which is that in so many cases, you're absolutely right. In so many cases, you'll run across a game that's, let's say, supposed to teach you about climate change, or is supposed to maybe shine light on human rights abuses, right? And several years ago already, there was a movement of these so-called, games that are more educational or didactic, or But what always struck me about so many of those games is that you're right. If you take away the surface narrative and you look at what's going on, is they almost invariably are resource management simulators. They're almost invariably, and I'm very, very skeptical about. Whatever, StarCraft is fun to play, of course, but I'm very, very skeptical about a resource management simulator, which is basically just a simulation of a market-based economy, right? Where you have generating agents that generate some value or some item, and then you have other parts of the game that consume those things. And then the game is about figuring out the balance of the things that generate value and the things that consume value. And so, yeah, I appreciate what you said, Mauro, about pushing your students to design games only as systems. And I want to see more of that. I want to see more experimental postures vis-a-vis networks, complex systems, interactive communities of agents, and then also rule sets and algorithmic processes, right? And so that's what I mean when I say that we don't really have a sophisticated counter gaming yet, even today, which is that so many games are reliant on a kind of on sort of like using the same algorithmic principles and then directing our attention elsewhere, which doesn't mean they fail as games, but they might fail in that very narrow sense of trying to think about logic and systematic interactivity in a different way.
And I would say this becomes particularly important at a time when, with gamification and the quantification of the self, it seems that this aesthetic of resource management, a sort of transition from from our leisure time to essentially our everyday time, even in the quantification of sleep patterns, for instance. It seems that we're now dealing with systems of quantification and management of data in all aspects of our lives. And you mentioned, yes, the chapter on counter gaming. It was sort of concluding the book and trying to sort of imagine how we can possibly challenge the mainstream. And there was throughout the book, actually, there is sort of ongoing reference to cinema and film studies, and particularly what was happening in the 60s and 70s. The figure of Jean-Luc Godard reappears throughout the book, and it's clear that you kind of hint at this, the possibility that something similar to what happened in cinema in the 60s might have happened, or could happen, might still happen in gaming. Sort of a system that kind of will challenge the dominant aesthetic, will bring to the fore the politics of the medium, of its representation, etc. So I would first like to ask you a question really about this attention to cinema and film, and particularly to film studies. So throughout the book, it seems that film is everywhere. There is a chapter on the first-person shooter, which is sort of a genealogy of the camera with a gun, and obviously looks back at cinema. But I would say even in the diagram that you present at the beginning of the book, connecting diegetic, non-diegetic with the human and machine action, Whenever I teach in my classes to students in media and communication, maybe they did some film studies at year one, they kind of somehow sometimes they told me that it feels like something they've already been doing in a film studies module, but with the addition of the human and machine actions, right? So there is this sort of diegetic, non-diegetic level, which is they're already familiar with. So it seems like you're starting from cinema in many ways, and trying to then open your eyes to gaming. In what ways cinema was important for the conception of this book?
Yeah, that's a great observation. I would agree that cinema, but also aesthetics and art more generally. I do want to just say two things about that, though. One is you're absolutely right. I'm not contesting that. But I will say, just for the record, I consider my posture vis-a-vis game studies and other fields is very much about pursuing a kind of medium specificity for games. And so you're absolutely right. That's probably my training, and particularly that chapter on the first person shooter brings into vivid detail a whole series of cinematic reference. But if I were going to get in a conversation with someone, I would always be the person who would say, no, games are not novels. Games are not cinema with interactivity. Games are not reducible to some other thing. That was part of my agenda in writing that book, mostly because it was relatively early and I felt very protective of games and gaming communities and didn't really want people to just kind of blunder into that domain and not know very much about it. And there were a lot of people who were trying to write about games who it was obvious they weren't gamers, and that sort of offended me. So I think it's important for me to say that at the outset, that if I'm guilty of anything, I hope it's actually medium specificity rather than trying to reduce games to some other medium like cinema or some other art tradition, aesthetics tradition. Yeah, so also, at this period, not everyone even thought that games were valid aesthetic objects to begin with, right? Maybe it's clear now we have bona fide auteurs, game designer auteurs who have been held up as, and maybe it's easier to make the case now, but at the time, games were trashy pop culture amusement things that, you did at the arcade or you did in your basement, when you were a teenager or something. And it's what kids did, right? It wasn't what a sophisticated, mature intellectual would want to write about. So I felt like I had to kind of try to invent a language where games could integrate with, let's say, conversations about realism or conversations about modernist aesthetics. And so that's why I turned to the notion of counter cinema and Jean-Luc Godard and that sort of tradition, because it struck me that would be something that would connect, mostly because some of the artists I was studying at the time, people like Jody.org, in my view, connect directly to the kind of avant-garde aesthetics that you get in someone like Jean-Luc Godard or earlier in modernist aesthetics. I want to hear Giacomo talk about a diegetic, non-diegetic, because you're right, that's a terminology that you see a lot in cinema, but you also get it in literary studies and also in theater. And, I'm very much influenced by Gérard Genette, the literary critic, particularly his work on thresholds and that sort of dynamic between the sort of enclosed space of play or of a narrative space versus some sort of event or space or reality that somehow is outside of that enclosed space of play. And you're right, that's borrowed from other aesthetic forms, but it really struck me as almost even more relevant in games. And one of the kind of sort of theses I propose in the book, and that I've written about elsewhere too, is that software-based systems and games in particular are much more interested in non-diegetic elements than what we would see in classic Hollywood-style film form, than we would see even in the novel, even in experimental novels. And so that really struck me as super interesting, right? Like, open up an RTS game and you're going to see equal amounts, if not more, non-diegetic material. And sometimes the entire game, you're playing the non-diegetic realm. And the diegetic realm is maybe now subordinate, not invisible or removed, but kind of subordinate. So yeah, I was drawn to those terms because it seemed like that was a way to actually make a real defendable claim about the sort of historical transformation of experience and humanity's relationship to media objects.
What you were saying about non-diegetical options you have in gaming, I think this point, for example, is very relevant for visual art and performance at all, because in performance and visual art, since the second avant-garde of the 50s, the environment, the atmosphere is the first element you have in the building of the experience of the performance, and it brings a lot of meanings and a lot of perceptions in the audience, more than the narrative path. The building of perception starts with non-diegetical features and not with the diegetic. The narrative comes later, and you can also bring a lot of meaning, for example, in the relation between social relations inside the performance and social relations in reality, only thanks to non-diegetical performances. If you think about the very first performances, then obviously the counter gaming syndrome comes. But if you consider the first Marina Abramović works in the 70s, she made only non-diegetical performances, but they were very shocking, very violent, very violent, and very relevant for the knowledge of the relations of violence inside the society at that time. Obviously, if you do now, it's another thing.
Yeah, that's exactly the dynamic I was trying to study and hopefully try to not answer maybe, but shine a light on this fascinating phenomenon, which is what happens when that moves from an ostensibly avant-garde experimental technique, right? The sort of revealing the apparatus of the Brechtian tradition or experimental tradition more generally. What happens when that moves into 100% into the mainstream, which I think has happened with software and with games in particular.
It's the paradox of the market. When things come to the market, they become part of the market itself. Yeah.
And maybe computers even invite that in a way that is more pressing, more imposing, perhaps, than other artistic media formats. You know, maybe you can't help but see the apparatus. Maybe you can't help but see the stuff that is more frequently hidden. So I don't know, and we're in a kind of topsy-turvy world now, right? Does that mean games are doing their own ideology critique in real time? Is that a problem? Does that mean that legacy tactics and strategies that artists have relied on for decades have now been neutered and defanged, can no longer be used. You know, if they're used by Blizzard and Activision, can artists and activists still use them anymore? I don't know. I think that's it's a new dynamic.
And I'm also wondering, sorry if I may jump in. So, Giacomo, you mentioned something about performance art and Marina Abramovic, and I've always been wondering, and that's really, I don't know as much as probably you do, so it's really an open question, but you know, in performance art, if you have to think about, for instance, the work of Marina Abramovic, there was some of the kind of fundamental aspects of their work was to, first of all, produce performances that were not recorded. There was no documentation, no live documentation, but at the same time, they would release a script. Well, there was a minimal kind of, some photos were taken. Some of them were completely undocumented intentionally by the artist. But at the same time, there would be a script being produced on how to replicate the performance. So in a sense, the only major documentation was the list of actions that one was supposed to replicate in order to redo the performance. I've always been wondering, in a sense, if there was maybe perhaps a response to what was happening at the time with the digitalization of information, the coming of the computer age. So in a sense, the most radical thing to do at the time was to, first of all, bring the body back to the fore, do something that's completely undocumented, but at the same time, reflect on how that action could be redone, reproduced in a different context. I'm not sure if this, I'm sure someone must have, you know, written something about this. I'm not much of an expert on performance art, but there's always been kind of, I don't know, in my mind when looking at for instance, the work of Marina Abramovic, Vito Acconci and others.
Mm-hmm. I really don't know if there's something written about this specific issue. What I can say about this point, I think it's a relevant point, and maybe it's the main differences now with the language of video games, is that you have an hidden medium with video games, because you have the code, you have the algorithm at the end as an hidden element, which is the real engine of all the experience. With theater and with performance, you don't have it. You have immediately the relation between human beings. Obviously, you have other hidden engines that are the system of social attitudes and habits we have. But this next element, the algorithm and this hidden element makes a big change in the experience at all. So if you consider the reenactment, starting from a source written or digitalized, obviously you have always to consider that you have the reenactment of a practice in a new context. But this is it is so in general. It is so in general. So the digital language changed performance a bit, just a bit, not as much as you can think. What is relevant is when in the language of performance you put not cinema, for example, that is quite possible. Now you can make live cinema, for example. You can have cinema in live, with live actors acting in front of you, but you see also them in the cinema at the same time. But it's not so relevant, I think, in our discussion. The relevant thing is when you decide to use the hidden engine, the algorithm, in performances. And it changes a lot. You use the system of video gaming in performances. And there's a very interesting example I can make that with a limit, it didn't become a meta performance, but only performance. It's a performance by Roger Bernat, a Spanish director, a Catalan director. He made this amazing performance that is called Pendiente de Voto. He brings 200 people about in a theater. They put in circle like in a parliament, half circle, like in a parliament, and there's an artificial engine with an algorithm to do. It starts to make questions to the people. First phase, everyone can vote. Yes, no, I don't vote. The algorithm puts out a question. People answer voting yes, no, no answer. After the end of the first section, there's the second section in which you must vote with somebody close to you. But it's not a person of the first time, because the seats are changed by the machine analyzing the data of your answer in the first phase. Now you have the second phase, and you have to find an agreement with the other person to answer to the question of the IA. Yes, no, don't answer. Then you have the third phase, in which you have political parties. And then you have the fourth and last phase, in which you have just one person to answer for all the people. And what happens? The system breaks down. And I mean, this is the only one example that I really know that it's a very clever and perfect combination between a video gaming kind of construction and performance, because they put video gaming in the experience of live performance.
Thank you. Yeah, I was taking note of the title of the performance. Thanks for that. I might have actually one more question for Alexander Galloway. And as we get near to the end of this event, I invite the guests and participants to write their questions. If you want to send me a private message in the chat system, I will then bring the question to the audience. Or if you want, you can just take the mic. If you feel more confident with asking your question in Italian, feel free to do so, and I will translate it for you. Just write to me in the chat box. I have one more question about the very ending of gaming. So in that famous chapter on counter gaming, I find it quite interesting, kind of looking back at it now, how you really conclude hoping for the emergence of an independent game development movement, right? Which was kind of starting at the time. I'm not sure if people were really using the word independence. There were actually some independent games being made at the time. And obviously we have seen a proliferation of independent titles in the game market. So with the so-called democratization of game development through the access to Unity and the Real or systems of online platforms of online distribution such as Steam, we have seen more and more independent games being made. There are a few obviously kind of remarkable examples, but mostly independent production turned to be another way to sort of another turn into the narrative of passion labor, really. So it invited more and more people to get into this, into a very crowded market of small producers of digital content. So in a sense, we have seen even there, sort of capitalistic capture operating in different ways. My question is not really about the independent game movement itself, but it's more about the notion of play and playfulness. So the sort of liberating potential that has often been associated with the notion of playing. That obviously we have seen this also in the Situationist International, but more recently we see it in things such as, for instance, in the game industry, right? So the idea of working at the games you like, the idea of making a play something that is part of your labor is extremely attractive. It's also at the same time the basis for a a very exploitative form of labor. So my question is really about the potential of play and playfulness in 2022. Do you think there is still room for playfulness in counter gaming or counter strategies of any kind?
Yeah, good. So chapter 5, the most controversial chapter. Why controversial? Well, maybe I should just say one or two sentences for people who aren't familiar with the book. So that chapter actually starts with a relatively narrow study about a community. For years in the late 90s and up till 2002, I worked at this arts nonprofit called Rhizome that was focusing on net art. So I was very much embedded in computer art communities and net art communities. And so I was really focusing on a group of artists who were making game mods. So in the early 2000s, there were a whole series of artists making game mods. So people like Corey Archangel, you might know the Super Mario Clouds piece. Jody.org have a whole series of different game mods. And I noticed that most, not all, but most of these projects did something very interesting, which is, while on the one hand, I think, in my view, being very interesting and successful artworks, many of them removed the gameplay. And that struck me as very interesting, right? Removed the gameplay. Why are these artists making mods? Why are they turning games into non-games? And so my maybe controversial or contentious conclusion was that we really don't have lots of examples of making art explicitly within that algorithmic space. And so that's why I was trying to kind of exhume this concept of counter gaming, which again, yes, goes back to analyses of counter cinema and the avant-garde tradition, and sort of using that to end the book with a plea that basically we need more experimentation in game design itself and in that kind of algorithmic layer of the game, and hoping to see more of that work in the future. And yeah, as you hint, Paolo, maybe if I was writing the book today, I would write it in a very, very different way, because we have a whole wonderful variety and spectrum of all sorts of indie and art games of various kinds. I mean, there's people who have reached a certain renown, people like Jason Rohr, the game maker and designer, or even popular games like Braid, I think sort of exploded lots of people's conceptions about game design. Anna Anthropy's work in a game like Dysphoria. I mean, even the Stanley Parable, as a kind of way to use the game engine in interesting ways. So I don't know, as you said, Paolo, though, this is all sort of complicated by the fact that the historical avant-garde privileged play. You read someone like Jacques Derrida, who is not a gamer, but thankfully, but you read someone like Jacques Derrida, and the work is just endless sort of critique and dismantling and showing the inherent kind of but there are certain things that escape his merciless gaze, and play is one of them, right? You look at to go back to the Situationists, they freely cited from theories of play, and so for them, play was something that somehow escaped the all-encompassing, oppressive, sort of commodity fetishism logic that someone like Guy Debord saw in images and in spectacles. So that's interesting that play was often exempted from withering critique, because play was thought to be an escape from dominant forms of culture or art making. And there's lots of other examples. We could talk about Fluxus, lots of other examples. And so I don't know, I still have a kind of bittersweet answer to your question, which is, at the very least, I don't think play has has survived the 20th century, frankly. I don't think it's survived unscathed as a sort of all-purpose way to redeem the authenticity of real life or something like that, and to escape the iron cage, etc. And so I would give a kind of bittersweet or mixed answer that, play is exploited as a form of labor, that these things are now like deeply intertwined, which maybe means we shouldn't, discard playful activities or looking at contingency, accident, whimsy, those kinds of qualities that play is expected to reveal and to produce. We shouldn't discard that, but I think we have to have a more sort of, realistic sense of the intertwining of play with, the industrial infrastructure and really sites of exploitation and all sorts of other things.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure if Mauro and Giacomo, if you have any other questions or comments. Otherwise, we might have a question from the audience, actually. We have two questions, actually. So, okay, I'll start with the first one from Gianmarco. So it's in Italian, so I'm going to translate it as I read it. So please forgive my. It's a bit of a tentative translation. So Gianmarco is asking, so before 2010, there were two conceptions of algorithms in video games, and which were both kind of close and opposite to each other. So on the one hand, we had the idea of playing with the algorithm that Alexander Galloway proposed, and then there was Jan Bogo's idea of an algorithm that, in a sense, it's imposing the meanings through a rhetoric. I guess the reference here is the procedural rhetoric. And these are two ideas that kind of started from different problematics, an aesthetic and ethic problematic, but then kind of also overlapped in different ways. And 15 years later, this dualism it still seems relevant today, particularly if you look at the impact of algorithms on our society, and also practices such as DALL-E, where we can kind of play with the algorithm in a way that is also becoming kind of common and easy to access. I guess that's the point. So the question is mostly for Alexander Galloway. The question is, how do you think throughout the years the cultural condition has changed regarding critical consciousness and the collective aesthetics of the algorithm? And can video games have a role in this change? They also apologizes for the long question at the same time.
No, that's an excellent question. I mean, in general, I'm a fan of Ian Bogo's work, and I think that his writing on procedural rhetoric, and he's also a maker, and so different projects he's made over the years. His focus on procedural rhetoric has helped dramatically. Just in the discourse, people being able to focus on all of these things that that I've been talking about throughout. Sort of like trying to understand the algorithmic dynamics. So anyway, I think he's an ally. I think he's a comrade in that attempt. And yeah, you mentioned DALL-E. I mean, I do actually think that AI generated game assets will do wonders for the sort of like decentralization of game design and production. So even me personally, like I don't, I primarily write essays and books and things like that, but I also try to make things, and I've wanted to make games for a long time, and one of the biggest things that has stopped me is all of the art assets. Just making models, making animation, making textures, making all that stuff. So anyway, that was just a little bit in your question, but I think actually we're in the beginning of a new wave in this sort of art art game design and indie game design, just because it'll be so much easier now just to procedurally generate models and textures and levels and music, actually, even. So
yeah, so Gianmarco is thanking you for your answer. Yeah, and there is another question actually from Gemma. Gemma, do you want to ask the question yourself, or otherwise I can just read it from the chat? I want to put you on the spotlight, but if you want to.
Oh, hi. Yeah. Hello. Let me just access the camera just real quick. Can I turn up the camera? Or?
Yeah, sure. Oh, yeah,
okay,
absolutely.
Okay. Hi, Alexander, and thank you again for this interesting talk. I have a question. The other day I was in a conference in Novi Sad, and I was talking with Professor Olli Sotama, and I was asking him in the area of video game research, if he thought that there were kind of any gaps regarding topics that have yet to be explored, especially by younger researchers. And he told me that he thinks that there is kind of a trend for some time in which video games are analyzed as a form of representation. And for example, there are very little researches about the concept of play, and also how the playful action is actually a central aspect of our life, but also for many other media and creative activities. So maybe it is a similar thread, like why we are talking not so much about games as systems, for example. So I was wondering if, in your opinion, what can be done to kind of recalibrate the focus on video games?
Can you maybe just say more, recalibrate the focus away from, you said, forms of representation, or?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, do you have any ideas? I think that's a good question.
No, yeah. For example, I'm seeing it with younger students, for example, when I'm trying to help them with the final the dissertation of their academic year. A lot of them are actually treating like video games as they were movies or a book. So they are very much focused on, for example, the characters. A very much trending topic is how the LGBT community is represented, and the way they are approaching them is like just describing characters. And I mean, they are describing video games characters, but they could be also movie characters, but they're not really much interested in analyzing the character within a kind of system, how the characters is developed within the system, and this kind of approach. So I was thinking about it, and maybe, I don't know, it is something that also deals with how maybe video games are also represented or discussed in the mainstream media, even with the like in the gaming sectors also. I don't know, it's kind of a trend. It is actually, sorry.
Yeah,
it's an open question also.
yeah, I mean, maybe I would just echo something that Giacomo was getting at earlier, which is really, yeah, we just need to return to sort of exercises about staging, if I can use that word, staging social dynamics. And you know, and it's true, this has a long important history in theater and in performance, experiments in social interaction. I think that's one of the things that's come out of the, I'll say, discovery. I mean, I'm sure it's not entirely a discovery, but the sort of larger discovery that game design really is an autonomous art form. And it's just like graphic design and designing buildings and, you know, so on, that it really takes a skill, and it's a craft. It's something you can learn. It's something you can be good at. And at the heart of it, I think, is sort of sculpting interesting forms of dynamic interaction between elements, and those can be people, those can be humans and machines, you know. So while there's a sort of benefiting from a general media literacy, there's a lot of interesting work being done, you know, let's say in machinima or in using different game making platforms like Twine games. Yeah, that would be one element of it. But if I were to say that we should focus on a certain area, yeah, I would maybe focus on sort of exercises, teaching people how to understand how to stage experiments in social interaction. That's probably the most important thing. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
And a lot of that stuff doesn't require a computer. You know, that's another thing that game designers will return to over and over again. You know, games can be computational and they can be mechanized, but a lot of the basic core stuff in games and game design does not need to be mechanized by a computer necessarily.
You could use Post-it also to draw on the mechanics of a game in a very, very basic level also, and to plan their interactions. Yeah, you're right. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess, you know, if you switch the focus, if you want to, I mean, I quite like this sort of reading of game design as a sort of practice or skill, perhaps, of designing social relations in a way. Even if you're designing a single player game, in a sense, you're designing a relation between a human and a machine. So in a sense, if we start thinking about it this way, then the game designer can have a sort of political function, or a function of also imagining different forms of relating between humans and non-humans, or across, you know, communities of humans mediated by images and machines at the same time. Yeah, okay. Right. So I'm getting, you know, also aware of the times, which we also started. So some of us actually they were here like a couple of hours ago. So there is we probably need to get to a close. So I would just like to, you know, thank everyone. I'm going to stop the recording in a minute. Obviously, that doesn't mean that you have to run away, but, you know, I'm going to stop the recording soon. I would like to thank our guests, so Mauro Salvador, Giacomo Pedini, and Alexander Galloway. Thank you so much for your participation. Thank you for this lovely conversation. Thanks to all the participants who join us this evening. So this has been you know, another great DiGRA Italia Talks. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully we're going to do more of this maybe next semester with other guests. So yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Paolo.
Actually, may I say just one thing? I just realized when I was preparing this presentation, which I guess it speaks of Alexander Galloway generosity. The copy that I have of gaming, it's actually a copy that you gave to me it was around 2007, 2008 when I was a lost master student. I was in New York for different reasons. I had this idea of applying to a PhD program. I had no idea what it meant. And you were really kind of having me to have a sort of conversation. I'm not even sure what I said. My English was really bad at the time, so I'm not even sure what I said. But you gave me a copy of Gaming. So in a sense, it's the same copy that I still have with me. So, you know, it's coming back, you know.
Yeah, no, I remember that. I remember that. So this is a nice way to kind of connect the circle. But yeah, let me just say again, I know how much work it is to do a translation. So, you know, Mauro and Giacomo, I'm just thrilled that you actually came up with this idea and saw it through to conclusion, and it's really wonderful. So thank you, and thank you, Paolo, for putting this event together today. Yeah,
actually, with Mauro and Giacomo, there are, you know, more and more modules and programs in Italy doing games, and obviously having text translated in Italian, written or translated in Italian is absolutely fundamental. So thank you so much for your work and for the, you know, contribution to the knowledge in the sector and for the Italian game studies community. So thank you so much.
And thank you, Alexander, for writing the book, obviously.
Yeah, I agree. No, thank you. Thank you too. Thank you for the book. Translating it was amazing, because when you translate, you have the time to think deeper in the things and to keep the things on you. So it was a real pleasure for me, and thanks, Paolo, for this occasion, because it let us meet together and talk together after 1 year and getting new points, new ideas. No, really thanks. I'm very happy.
Well, thank you for all your work. All right. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you, guys. Thanks.